National oil companies are those companies that are not private, they are state-owned or have a substantial amount of investment by the state. So in China we have 3 national oil companies, or NOCs. Under the communist system there was the Ministry of Petroleum, and that evolved when it was liberalised and reformed to become 3 separate companies that are a kind of a hybrid of being private but also state-owned, so they're quite peculiar in that respect.
There's a concern in places like the US, Europe, Australia, elsewhere, often that these companies are both driven by commercial opportunity but also are listening to Beijing's foreign policy and strategic interests.
Since the mid-90s, the Chinese oil companies have entered into Africa in quite a concerted way. In those oil-producing countries, you've had a period of very high oil prices. And that is when these Chinese companies, who were needing to import oil for the first time, looked abroad for that supply. Some of the countries they're investing, for example, in Sudan, they're the major player. So whatever they do in Sudan has big implications for the Sudanese economy.
There was a perception in some quarters in Beijing that oil produced by Chinese companies overseas was somehow less expensive and more secure than oil purchased on the open market. Some of the major international players like Shell, like BP, had been doing this for decades. And so a lot of the good assets open to foreign equity participation were already in the hands of these international oil companies. The other appeal of Sudan was that they weren't going to face as much competition.
The Chinese come in and do what's called a resource swap. They trade oil for an infrastructure investment project. We want to track through whether that new investment really does produce kind of benefits. So does it increase the productivity of the economy? It should do. If you've got new roads, new railway tracks, etc., that should be good.
The Chinese national oil companies are learning from their experience. They've been out there now 15, 20 years. So the project's also about how are they changing to adjust to operating in these very complex environments and meeting both their commercial interests but also meeting the best interests of the countries where they're investing.
We think we know about how Chinese firms in the oil sector are operating. We have a pretty good feel for the political dynamics in those African countries that are our case studies. But when you add those two together, the key is what does that actually mean in terms of outcomes for development, for job creation and inclusiveness.
China, when it invests in many of these countries, it'll bring thousands of Chinese workers in to do the project and not hire locals. The Chinese have to learn that that's not the way you do business in the international system anymore, because that creates resentment at a local level.
There's generally a kind of correlation between resource investment and conflict, and what we really need to think about is how to obviously avoid that and maximise the benefits from that revenue and those new rents. And we hope the findings that we have will feed into those ongoing debates about how you can make development much more inclusive and not exclusive, just benefiting a few.